Now, the last elections were local government elections, and the ANC faltered there in several other big metropolitan municipalities, especially in the Gauteng province, the most populous province of South Africa. And the ANC in all of the, especially 3 metros in the Gauteng province, remained the biggest party, but fell short of having an outright majority in those metropolitan municipalities of Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Ekurhuleni. Ekurhuleni, they stayed in power with minor coalitions with small parties. In Pretoria and Johannesburg, the opposition parties, through unlikely cooperation agreements between the Democratic Alliance and the Economic Freedom Fighters, they managed to edge the ANC out in those municipalities. The reasons for the ANC in these municipalities falling short of outright majorities really go to the heart of South African politics at this stage. And that was that the image of the ANC, people also have become used to the ANC, and 23 years by now after the 1994 liberation elections, and people have become more cynical. They've seen much corruption around government, and they do not necessarily think that opposition parties have got the ultimate answers, but they also want to give the ANC a scare and want to push the ANC to do things better. That said, generally, it was a very interesting protest vote for the ANC, against the ANC in those elections, because the vast majority of Black African voters did not go and vote against the ANC, but in large numbers they abstained from participating in these local government elections. And opposition parties, in contrast, especially the Democratic Alliance, which was by far the biggest of the opposition parties, but very much short of a big majority, or of any majority, but they could get the majority together by working with the EFF. But the DA, Democratic Alliance, managed to get their voters out en masse. They voted, and one could see the turnout rates. And of course, the defeat then of the ANC in these big metropolitan areas, very much the case of electoral system. At the local government election, half the elected representatives are elected in terms of a constituency or a ward-based system, and the other half on proportional representation. And it was really that electoral system and the PR vote that meant the Democratic Alliance could garner votes that would help it get more of the PR seats. That really helped the DA in that election. So it was a relative loss. The ANC remained the biggest party, but strategically in these metros and a serious range of smaller municipalities, they ceded majorities. And last point on this is that it was only a few enclaves in the country where the ANC actually increased its majority in the election, like in northern KwaZulu-Natal, a few areas in the province of the Northern Cape, but almost a blanket across the country. The ANC support went down in that local government election, and that is what makes the anticipation of the 2019 national and provincial elections in South Africa such a big issue. Because in some provinces, like Gauteng, for example, the ANC could actually cede an outright majority. And the question is, at the national level, while it's unlikely that the ANC would cede a majority, it could lose a serious additional amount of support. The ANC is seriously suffering from problems in promoting that new generation of leaders. It is because of the extensive control of the old age of leaders that generation still believes, and it's probably true, that a lot of their political fortunes depend on keeping that notion of liberation alive, keeping the notion of a continuous fight, struggle against those scourges of apartheid. Racism continues in South Africa, of colonialism. There's much evidence of still continuous colonial inequalities, racial inequalities, income disparities in South Africa. And that are all reminders to the ordinary population that yes, there might be some incomplete transitional tasks, things that remain to be done. And the ANC is very strong in its campaigning to promote those ideas. In fact, it depends in this day and age very much on the ordinary elected citizens believing that the liberation struggle is continuing. And that's it. That is why the ANC is also loath to go against keeping the older generation of leaders in politics, because those leaders are literal reminders to people of that liberation struggle that's still continuing. It's also due to much factional control in the ANC. There is a wide range of very promising leaders also in the ANC, younger people, but they are not sufficiently trusted by the incumbents in the ANC to be loyal to the old guard and to ensure that the older guard, sometimes tainted by corruption, will remain protected as we transition into a future political system in which the electorates will be young, increasingly young, rebellious, and won't have direct memories of that liberation struggle. So the older generation is part of their protection of the liberation gains and the credibility of keeping an idea of the liberation struggle alive. They feel they need those older leaders, but they could suffer serious deficits in support because of that. The ANC has really, in the time of Zuma, become a factionless control party. It was normal practice for a leadership contest to take place, for land leader to take over, unhappy people, but things went on and the same party continued. In the time of Zuma, it became really one faction that started controlling the ANC. And surreptitiously in this process, it also became one person that controlled that faction. And that person is President Jacob Zuma. He is extremely astute, very strategic in his thinking, at keeping his interests protected. Over the period of time that Zuma has been in power, he in 2007 became ANC president, and 2 years after that president of South Africa. But he has deployed people around him. He has made sure that he knows what skeletons they might have hidden behind, what if they had been involved in corruption, for example. He has that information. He works very closely with the security establishment, and he keeps people in control. And he has got such widespread deployment of people who are loyal to him across the state by now, that type of factionalism is doing damage to state institutions, to democratic institutions in the country. And that is what I call deep institutional damage, deep factionalist entrenchment in the current South African state. And that protects Zuma and helps Zuma to probably get a candidate in place. He's working very hard at that, who would help protect him after he has gone from politics. But the big tragedy of that situation is that it is deep factionalism that cannot be extracted by now without also doing serious damage to the South African state. So many other institutions are occupied by Zuma loyalists. Even if a person who can bring a presidential candidate, for example, who can bring cleaner governance to South Africa, less corruption, or maybe even rule out corruption, although that might be a very tough task. Even if such a person comes into power, state institutions have become damaged and will become damaged further in this process of factionalism having a very, very big time in South African politics. Even by now, relatively early in this year of 2017, eyes are increasingly focused on the ANC's National Elective Conference, which will happen in Gauteng province in middle of December this year. That conference, of course, has got a dual mandate to determine policy, and in preparation for that, the ANC will have a national policy conference in June this year that will adopt policy proposals that then will have to be endorsed at the National Elective Conference. But as we have seen at all previous occasions, electoral politics take over and policy hardly becomes important at that conference that will then happen at the end of the year. The ANC has got this official policy, but that's official policy. It doesn't really work like that. Candidates should not be campaigning prematurely. They are frowned upon if they announce their candidacies beforehand. But we know that is taking place, and President Zuma himself has set that example on both previous occasions in 2007 and 2012, both those elective conferences where he was elected and then re-elected. He campaigned under this mantle of, I'm not campaigning, but he had strong campaigns that mobilized civil society, that mobilized the party, the loyal ordinary citizens strongly. So he has really set the example for campaigning without saying, I am campaigning. So at this stage, we know there are primarily two candidates emerging in this race to become the next ANC president. It is important to note that there is a small possibility that a person can even run for a third term as ANC president. The Constitution of South Africa prohibits that it could be done at the national level, but for the ANC, it can be done. Chances, however, are unlikely. Also because President Zuma has already endorsed just recently outgoing Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who was the AU African Union chairperson, and it is important that she is also a former spouse to the president because she remains very well integrated into the Zuma clan. They have some children, and many of those interests run alongside one another. And in this context of no campaigning, the president has also recently de facto endorsed Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as president, saying South Africa is ready for a woman president. And there in this non-campaigning campaigns, gender is used as a substitute for, yes, South Africa is ready for a woman. There are also other potential women candidates, but Dlamini Zuma is very much the front runner. Opposed to that is also Deputy President of the ANC and South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, at this stage. It is assumed, and he has actually said, the candidates nowadays announce their candidacies in Sunday newspaper interviews, not in the ANC structures where they're not supposed to be campaigning. But he has also made it clear that he is available. And his campaign is running very strongly. It's very important that his campaign ties in very well into the factionalism and anti-factionalism drive in the ANC, because the Zumahist faction, who was also endorsing Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, they are running against those who are advocating for cleaner government. Cyril Ramaphosa there is aligned with Minister of Finance, head of the Treasury in South Africa, Pravin Gordhan. And they have been targeted and victimized by the Zumahist faction in the ANC, who wants to and is seen in every which way to be campaigning for increased personal financial benefit. Many corrupt deals are pursuing President Jacob Zuma. He has been avoiding court appearances from the time that he assumed power 10 years ago by now. It has always been what is called the Stalingrad strategy: delay, postpone, delay, find another appeal. But those court cases are still pursuing them. And it is in that context that he has a great interest, President Zuma, a great interest in whether Cyril Ramaphosa succeeds or not, and whether that faction then against the Zumas, the Ramaphosa, Pravin Gordhan, Ministry of Finance faction, are seen to be succeeding over the Zumahist faction. So these are the two main factions running to become the next president of the ANC and of South Africa. You know, this issue is budding just under the surface. We know the academic years in South Africa, universities are just restarting their business now, just started going. And so far, it's relatively protest-free, but the issues are budding under. There is mobilization. They could, and at the drop of the hat, those protests could resurface again. We know by now they've gone through basically two phases. Late 2015, September, October 2016, they were continuing, and the issues have not been resolved. The ANC in government and the Ministry of Higher Education, they've had a few steps. We've seen, for example, there's been a limit on fee increases. Fee increases were limited to 8% for the new academic year of 2017 now, but still there were increases. The National Student Fund, funding for disadvantaged students, the limit for getting aid there has been pushed up to a relatively middle class level. So many more students are now eligible to get funding to help them through their studies. But the students are campaigning for free higher education, and they do not regard the concessions that they've had so far as giving them, and it isn't free education. There is a much pressure on the fiscus in South Africa to make more money available for better chunks of that education to be sponsored. But it is not there yet, and students are mobilizing. It could erupt again at any point in this time. And we know the student leadership, they come and they go. It's interesting, a few of the previous year's top students are nowadays studying some places, amongst others, in Europe at very prestigious institutions in Europe. And there's been a natural, the student movement regards themselves as very democratic, and there's been natural transitions. Currently, new groups of student leaders are trying to motivate and inspire, and we could very well see further eruptions of student protests as we move further down the line in South Africa, because whereas fees might be covered and some living expenses might be covered, a huge part of tuition and study costs anywhere are accommodation costs, living costs, study materials, books, textbooks included, transport. All those issues remain to be covered, and students are still mobilizing. And we've seen recent very strong statements from prominent student leaders who are reminding us that it just takes students to speak with one voice, speak at strategic places directly to government, for example, outside Parliament or outside the headquarters of the African National Congress in downtown Johannesburg. And as this person said, the ANC, the government, listens. The ANC and government sees these as the future electorate in South Africa, and they try to remain on their good side.